3 years I spent in Edinburgh, buried in folklore texts and crumbling manuscripts. 3 years of damp stone lecture halls and library basements that smelled of mold and centuries-old paper. 3 years learning to read the dead languages of dead peoples, cataloging their myths and superstitions with the clinical detachment my professors demanded. Then summer came, and with it an opportunity I couldn't refuse. The Museo Archeologico Nazionale in Naples needed a cataloger. Someone to spend 8 weeks photographing and documenting artifacts in their archives. The posting had circulated through the department for weeks before I finally applied, convinced I'd be competing against a dozen more qualified candidates. Turns out nobody else wanted to spend their summer in a museum basement. Their loss, I suppose. Though, looking back now, and I do look back, more often than I'd care to admit, maybe they knew something I didn't. I arrived in Naples on a Tuesday in early June. The heat hit me the moment I stepped off the train at Napoli Centrale, a wall of Mediterranean warmth that made my wool trousers cling to my legs and my shirt stick to my back within minutes. Edinburgh hadn't prepared me for this. Nothing really could have. I spent the first night in a cramped pensione near the station, listening to motorinos buzz past my window until 3 in the morning, sweating through sheets that smelled faintly of lavender and cigarette smoke. But the museum was something else entirely. My first day, I stood in the entrance hall and just breathed. Marble floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, vaulted ceilings painted with frescoes that had survived wars and earthquakes and the slow erosion of time. Tourists milled past me toward the Farnese collection, their voices echoing off the ancient walls, and I felt small in a way that had nothing to do with my height, small in the way you feel when you're standing in the presence of history itself. Dr. Jasmine Wilkins found me there, gawking at the architecture when I should have been reporting to her office. Mr. Bridges, not a question, a statement. She knew exactly who I was, which meant she'd been watching me stand there slack-jawed for God knows how long. I turned. She was shorter than I'd expected, 5'4" at most, with silver-streaked hair pulled back so tight it seemed to tug at the corners of her eyes. Those eyes. Dark brown, nearly black in the dim light of the hall, and they studied me with an intensity that made me want to apologize for something I hadn't done. "Dr. Wilkins, I'm sorry, I was just—" "You were admiring the building." Her accent was Italian, pronounced and unhurried, each word placed with precision. "This is not unusual. Come, we have work to discuss." She didn't wait to see if I'd follow, just turned on her sensible heels and walked, expecting me to keep pace. I did, already learning. Her office occupied a cramped corner of the administrative wing, far from the grandeur of the public galleries. Filing cabinets lined every wall, stacked with papers and folders that seemed to defy basic organizational logic. A single window, narrow and grimy, let in a sliver of afternoon light that fell across her desk in a golden stripe. She sat, gestured for me to do the same. "You have studied folklore," she said. Not reading from my file, she had it memorized, apparently. Scottish traditions primarily, but also Norse and Celtic mythology. You read Latin, some Greek. Your professors speak well of you. That's very kind of them. It is accurate. She folded her hands on the desk, thin fingers interlaced. "I do not hire based on kindness, Mr. Bridges. I hire based on competence. You are competent. This is why you are here." A compliment, I think. Hard to tell with her. "Thank you, Dr. Wilkins." "Do not thank me yet." She reached into a drawer and withdrew a set of keys on a heavy iron ring. Old keys, tarnished with age, nothing like the modern security badges I'd seen the other staff wearing. "I am assigning you to the basement archives. You will work there for the duration of your appointment." The basement, not the main collection, not the restoration labs where the other summer staff would be stationed. The basement. I must have let something show on my face because her expression shifted, just slightly, just a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. "This is not a punishment," she said. "The basement archives hold items that require special handling, things too damaged for display, too mundane for public interest, too disturbing for the average visitor." That last word hung in the air between us. Disturbing. "What sort of items?" I asked. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she slid the keys across the desk toward me. "You will photograph each artifact, measure it, describe it in detail for our digital catalog. Some of these items have not been properly documented since the 1940s, perhaps longer. It is tedious work, but necessary." I picked up the keys. They were heavier than they looked, cold against my palm. "Any questions?" 100, 1,000, but I shook my head because I knew somehow that she wouldn't answer them. Not yet. Not until I'd proven myself worthy of answers. Good. She stood, indicating our meeting was finished. "The basement entrance is through the service corridor behind the Pompeii Gallery. The elevator does not work. You will use the stairs. Do not wander beyond the marked sections. And Mr. Bridges?" I paused at the door, one hand on the frame. "Do not remove any artifacts from the archives, for any reason. Is that understood?" "Yes, Dr. Wilkins." She held my gaze for a moment longer, then nodded, sharp and final, and turned back to her work. The stairs descended for what felt like ages. Concrete steps, worn concave in the centers from decades of foot traffic, spiraling down into darkness that my torch barely penetrated. The temperature dropped with each flight. First a relief from the oppressive heat above, then something else entirely. A coolness that settled into my bones and stayed there. By the time I reached the bottom, I could see my breath. The basement archives weren't what I'd expected. Not a single room, but a labyrinth of corridors, branching off in directions that seemed to follow no logical pattern. Exposed brick walls, some sections dating back centuries judging by the construction methods. Bare bulbs hung from cables strung along the ceiling, casting pools of yellow light that left vast stretches of shadow between them. And the artifacts. God, the artifacts. They lined the corridors on metal shelving units that stretched from floor to ceiling. Pottery shards wrapped in tissue paper. Bronze implements green with verdigris. Stone fragments carved with symbols I didn't recognize. And I recognized quite a lot after 3 years of study. Wooden boxes sealed with wax, their contents hidden. Glass cases containing things I couldn't identify in the dim light and wasn't sure I wanted to. I spent that first day just walking, getting a sense of the space, the scope of what I'd been assigned to document. The corridors branched and doubled back, intersected at odd angles, created dead ends where I'd expected through passages. I got lost twice before I learned to count my turns. No sounds from above reached this deep. No rumble of traffic, no murmur of tourists, no footsteps of staff going about their business. Just my own breathing and the soft scuff of my shoes on stone floors that had been walked upon since before my country existed. I set up my workstation in a small alcove near the main stairwell. Folding table, laptop, camera equipment, measuring tools, the basics of documentation. I photographed my first artifact, a ceramic oil lamp, Roman by the look of it, cracked along one side, and felt something settle in my chest. This was where I was meant to be. The days took on a rhythm after that. I'd arrive at 9, descend into the cool darkness, and lose myself in the work until 6, sometimes later, if I forgot to check the time. The silence helped me focus in ways the university library never had. No conversations to overhear, no footsteps to track, no distractions beyond the artifacts themselves. And what artifacts they were. Funeral masks from cultures I couldn't place. Tablets inscribed with scripts that predated Latin by centuries. Small carved figures that seemed to watch me from their shelves, eyes worn smooth by time but somehow still present. I photographed them all, measured them, described them in careful academic language that felt inadequate to what I was seeing. Some items I noticed bore small red tags. Dr. Wilkins hadn't mentioned those. When I asked about them during our weekly check-in, she simply said, "Document the others first," and change the subject. I didn't push, not then. The isolation suited me. It always had, really. I'd never been comfortable in crowds, never mastered the easy social rhythms that seemed to come naturally to others. Give me a quiet room and something ancient to study, and I was content. Happy even in my own peculiar way. Down in the archives, surrounded by the forgotten remnants of civilizations long dead, I found a kind of peace I hadn't known I was searching for. The chaos of the public floors above, the tourists and their cameras, the school groups and their shouting, the constant press of bodies and noise and modern life, felt impossibly distant, another world entirely. I'd emerge at the end of each day, blinking in the evening light, and feel almost surprised to find that the 21st century still existed. Then I'd return to my pensione, eat dinner at a small trattoria around the corner, fall asleep to the sound of motorinos and dream of dark corridors and silent rooms. I should have known it couldn't last, that the peace I'd found was borrowed, not earned, that some things are buried for reasons the living aren't meant to understand. But I didn't know. Not yet. I was just a young man from Edinburgh, cataloging artifacts in a basement, content in my solitude. The summer stretched ahead of me, full of promise. Third week in, I found something I wasn't supposed to find. That's how it goes, isn't it? You spend years preparing for a thing, reading about it, dreaming about it. Then you get there and the reality's nothing but dust and paperwork and the slow tedium of proper cataloging, until it isn't. I'd been working my way through the east corridor of the basement, methodical, room by room, shelf by shelf. The kind of work that makes your back ache and your eyes blur, but feels honest somehow. Important. Most of what I'd documented so far was unremarkable. Broken pottery, corroded coins, fragments of frescoes wrapped in linen that had yellowed to the color of old teeth. But that Thursday morning, I reached a door I hadn't noticed before. Set back in an alcove, half hidden by a rolling cart someone had abandoned decades ago. The wood had warped in its frame, swollen with humidity. Above the lintel, carved into the stone itself, were Latin words worn nearly smooth by time. Cave, ne intres, beware, do not enter. My pulse quickened. Couldn't help it. I told myself it was just an old storage warning. Victorian curators were dramatic about these things. Poison residue from preservation chemicals, maybe, or structural instability. Nothing supernatural. Nothing to get worked up about. I pushed the cart aside. The wheels squealed against the floor, metal grinding on stone, and the sound echoed down the corridor behind me. I waited. Listened. Nobody came. The door stuck for a moment, then gave with a groan. Inside, the air tasted different. Thicker, stale in a way that went beyond mere decades. The electric torch in my hand carved a pale circle through the darkness, illuminating shapes I couldn't immediately parse. Shelves, yes, but collapsed, several of them, their contents spilled across the floor in a chaos of broken crates and scattered artifacts. Something had happened here. Some kind of, what? Earthquake? The building settling? Or had someone torn through this place in a hurry, searching for something? I picked my way through the debris. Careful. Methodical. A ceramic vessel lay in shards near my foot. Amphorae fragments. Domestic ware, nothing special. But deeper in, past the fallen shelving, I spotted something that made me crouch down and peer closer. A wooden box. Small. Maybe 8 inches by 12. Wedged into the gap where a shelf had collapsed against the wall. The wood was dark with age, almost black, and bound with iron straps that had rusted to a deep orange. No label, no inventory number that I could see. Just this plain, unassuming container shoved into a corner and forgotten. Or hidden. I worked it free. The iron bit into my palms, rough and cold, and for a moment I thought of the warnings carved above the door. Cave, ne intress. But I was already inside, wasn't I? Already committed. The clasp had corroded shut. I had to work at it with my penknife, scraping away decades of oxidation until the mechanism finally gave. The lid resisted, then opened with a sound that reminded me of someone exhaling. Inside, nested in cloth that had rotted to gray wisps, lay a face. A mask. Bronze, I realized, once my heart stopped hammering quite so hard. Hammered bronze, the kind of work that took real skill. Small, too small for an adult. A child's face, rendered in metal. The features were delicate, almost feminine, with high cheekbones and a slight curve to the lips that might have been a smile or might have been a grimace. Impossible to say. But the eyes were hollow. Empty sockets rimmed with silver that had tarnished over the centuries to a black so deep it seemed to drink the torchlight. I couldn't look away from them. Couldn't stop imagining what they might have seen, whose face had worn this thing, whose small hands had... I closed the box. My fingers were trembling. I noticed that with a kind of detached curiosity. The way you notice things about yourself when your body's doing something your mind hasn't quite caught up with. I was scared. Properly scared in a way I couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely. I took the box to Dr. Wilkins. She was in her office on the 3rd floor, surrounded by paperwork and the smell of strong tea. When I knocked, she didn't look up immediately, just held up one finger while she finished writing something in her ledger. Precise, unhurried. The silver in her hair caught the lamplight. "Mr. Bridges, what is it?" I set the box on her desk. "Found this in the east corridor, one of the sealed rooms." She looked at the box, then at me. Her pen had stopped moving. "Which room?" "The one with the Latin warning above the door. Cave ne intress. The shelving had collapsed inside, I think maybe years ago, and this was... You opened it. Not a question." Yes. I thought it might be significant. The craftsmanship alone. "Show me." I opened the box again. The mask stared up at us with those empty, tarnished eyes. Dr. Wilkins's face changed. I've tried to describe it since that moment, and I always come back to the same inadequate phrase. The color drained out of her, like someone had pulled a plug somewhere and let all the life run out through her feet. Her lips pressed together until they nearly disappeared. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Behind the collapsed shelf. In the back corner. There's no inventory tag, no documentation that I could..." "There wouldn't be." Her voice had gone tight, controlled in a way that suggested she was working very hard to keep it that way. Certain items from the Pompeii excavations were sealed away, deliberately, for reasons the museum no longer discusses openly. What kind of reasons? She didn't answer, just stood there looking at the mask with an expression I couldn't read. "Dr. Wilkins, what kind of reasons would make someone seal away..." "Stop!" She grabbed my wrist. The strength of it shocked me. This small, wiry woman with her silver-streaked hair and her sensible shoes, and she had my arm in a grip that made the bones ache. Her eyes met mine, and whatever I saw in them made the questions die in my throat. "Listen to me carefully, Mr. Bridges." Her Italian accent had thickened, the way it did when she was upset. Some things were buried because they needed to stay buried. Do you understand? This mask, these items, they were sealed away by people who knew what they were doing, who understood things that you and I do not have the luxury of understanding. But if we could study... No. Her grip tightened. You will return this mask to exactly where you found it. You will close that door, and you will never enter that room again, not for any reason, not even if someone orders you to. Do you understand me?" I nodded. What else could I do? She held my gaze for another long moment. Then she released my wrist and stepped back, smoothing her blazer with hands that weren't quite steady. "Go. Now. Before anyone else sees." I went. Back down to the basement. Back through the east corridor. Back to that door with its worn warning and its warped frame. I replaced the box exactly where I'd found it, wedged into that gap behind the collapsed shelf. Closed the lid. Left the room. Pulled the door shut behind me and stood there in the corridor, my heart pounding against my ribs. I should have been relieved. Should have felt the weight lift from my shoulders, knowing I'd done what she asked. But all I could think about was the mask, those hollow eyes, the questions Dr. Wilkins had refused to answer. Some things were buried, because they needed to stay buried. But why? What had those Victorian curators known? What had they seen? I pushed the cart back in front of the door, covered my tracks, walked back to my workstation and sat down at my desk and stared at the catalog ledger without seeing it. The curiosity was already there, growing, a splinter I couldn't stop touching. I'd do what Dr. Wilkins asked. Stay out of that room. Leave the mask alone, for now. The apartment wasn't much. 2 rooms above a tobacco shop on a narrow street off the Piazza Dante, the kind of place that smelled perpetually of the landlady's cooking from downstairs, garlic and olive oil and something else, something green and herbal that I never could identify. The walls were thick plaster, painted that particular shade of cream that everything in Naples seemed to be painted, and the ceiling had a crack running from the window to the corner that I'd stare at some nights when sleep wouldn't come. I'd taken the place for the price and the location, nothing more. 20 minutes walk to the museum, a small balcony where I could drink my morning coffee and watch the pigeons squabble on the rooftops. The bed was too soft, and the shutters didn't quite close properly, letting in slivers of street light that fell across the floor in crooked lines. That night, though. That night the shutters were latched tight. I'd made certain of it. Something about the day had left me unsettled. The mask, of course. Dr. Wilkins's face when she'd found me there, the way her expression had gone from irritation to something else, something that looked almost frightened before she'd smoothed it away. The locked room, the questions I hadn't asked but should have. I'd lain awake for hours, listening to the street sounds die away, the motor scooters, the distant music from the cafes, the couples arguing in rapid Neapolitan that I could only half understand. Eventually even those faded, and there was just the settling of the old building around me, the creak of floorboards somewhere above, the distant hum of the city that never quite went silent. I don't know when I finally slept. Midnight, maybe. Later. But I know exactly when I woke. The laughter came from everywhere. That's the only way I can describe it. Not from the street, not from the stairwell, not from the apartment above. Everywhere. The walls themselves seemed to hold it, to amplify it, to pass it back and forth between them until the sound filled the room completely. A child's laughter. High and bright and utterly wrong. I lay frozen. My eyes were open. I know they were open because I could see the ceiling, could see that crack running its familiar path toward the corner. But I couldn't move. My arms wouldn't lift. My legs wouldn't swing to the floor. Even my fingers, curled in the sheets, felt locked in place, as though the laughter had turned my blood to something cold and thick. It wasn't a happy sound. That's what I understood, lying there. Children laugh from joy, from delight, from that pure, uncomplicated pleasure they take in the world. This wasn't that. This was the shape of laughter without the substance, the form without the feeling. As if something that had never known joy was attempting to reproduce the sound from memory, from observation, from listening to real children in some place I didn't want to imagine. The laughter circled the room. I could track it now. Not its source, there was no source, but its movement. It passed along the wall by the door, swept across the shuttered window, lingered in the corner by the wardrobe. Then it was above me, pressing down from the ceiling, and I squeezed my eyes shut and felt my chest go tight. God. The mask. Those hollow eyes, that grinning mouth. The connection was immediate and irrational and absolutely certain. I thought of the face I'd seen in the archive room, the way it had seemed to watch me even though it couldn't watch anything, the symbols carved into its surface that had made my palms itch just looking at them. The laughter grew louder, closer, as if whatever made the sound was leaning in, studying me, taking my measure the way I'd taken the measure of 1,000 artifacts over the years, cataloging me. My throat tried to make a sound, a cry, a prayer, I don't know, but nothing came out, just a strangled whisper that the laughter swallowed whole. And then, silence. Not the ordinary silence of a room at night, not the comfortable quiet of sleeping streets and closed shutters and a city at rest. This was absence, void, the complete and total removal of sound from the world. I couldn't hear my own breathing. I knew I was breathing. I could feel my chest rising and falling, could feel the air moving in my lungs. But the sound of it had been taken from me. The creak of the building, gone. The distant hum of the city, gone. Even the blood rushing in my ears, that ocean sound you hear when everything else goes quiet, gone. My throat tightened, not from crying, not from screaming, but from something else, something primal. The body's response to a wrongness it couldn't name. I've read accounts of this. In the old texts, in the folklore I'd spent 3 years studying in Edinburgh's cramped library carols, the old Scots called it the hush before the hunt, the moment when the prey understands that it has been seen, that something is coming, that running would be pointless, but staying still is unbearable. I'd thought it was metaphor, poetic license, the kind of embellishment that creeps into stories after centuries of retelling. It isn't metaphor. My hands were shaking. I could feel them trembling against the sheets, could feel the fine tremors running through my fingers, but I couldn't hear the fabric rustling, couldn't hear anything at all. The silence pressed against my eardrums, a physical weight, and I thought absurdly of deep water, of diving too far down and feeling the pressure build until your ears pop and your chest aches and every instinct screams at you to surface. I don't know how long it lasted. Seconds. Minutes. Time had gone strange, had stretched and compressed in ways that made no sense. Then, a motor scooter on the street below, distant, ordinary. The mechanical whine of an engine that needed tuning. Sound rushed back like water breaking through a dam. The building creaked. Somewhere above, a door closed. My own breathing, ragged and too fast, filled my ears. I lay there until dawn, not sleeping, not moving, just watching the crack in the ceiling and listening to the ordinary sounds of the world return. Morning light made everything seem impossible. That's the thing about daylight, isn't it? It has a way of making the night feel distant, unreal, the product of an overactive imagination and too much stress. I sat on the edge of the bed as the sun came through the gaps in the shutters and told myself I'd dreamed it. A nightmare, nothing more. The product of an unsettling day and an unfamiliar city and an artifact that had gotten under my skin. The mask. Those hollow eyes. I pushed the thought away, stood, stretched the stiffness from my back and the fear from my limbs. My reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin looked pale, dark circles under my eyes, but that was just exhaustion, just a bad night in a new place. I washed my face, Cold water from the tap splashed against my cheeks, running down my chin. The shock of it helped, grounded me. I was Beau Bridges, 24 years old, a graduate of the University of Edinburgh with a degree in folklore and anthropology, and I did not believe in things that went bump in the night. I believed in the stories about them. That was different. The coffee pot sat on the small stove in the corner. I'd fill it, light the burner, make my morning espresso the way the landlady had shown me. Then I'd walk to the museum and spend the day cataloging ordinary artifacts. And by tonight, the memory of that laughter would have faded to nothing. I crossed the room toward the kitchen alcove and stopped. The door was open, not just unlocked, open. Standing ajar by perhaps 6 inches, enough that I could see the dim landing beyond, the top of the staircase that led down to the street. I stared at it. My hand was still reaching for the coffee pot, frozen in mid-motion, and I lowered it slowly to my side. I'd locked that door. I remembered locking it. The heavy iron key, the satisfying click of the mechanism engaging, the habit of checking twice because my mother had always told me to check twice. The door was open, 6 inches, maybe more. I approached it slowly the way you'd approach a dog you weren't sure about, each step deliberate. My bare feet silent on the tile floor. The morning light from the shutters threw long shadows across the room, and the shadow of the door itself fell across the threshold, a dark line that seemed to pulse and shift as I moved closer. The landing beyond was empty, just worn wooden boards and peeling wallpaper and the smell of the tobacco shop drifting up from below. Nothing out of place, nothing waiting. I reached for the door. Meant to close it, to lock it again, to pretend this was some quirk of old hardware and older buildings. Then I saw the frame. The symbols had been scratched into the wood. Carved, really. Shallow grooves that caught the morning light and threw tiny shadows of their own. They ran down the left side of the doorframe in a vertical line, perhaps a dozen of them, each no larger than my thumbnail. I knew them. Not their meaning. I didn't know their meaning, couldn't read them any more than I could read Linear A or the undeciphered scripts of the ancient world. But I knew their shapes, the curves and angles, the way they seemed to flow into one another, the particular geometry that made them look almost organic, almost alive. The mask, the bronze face in the archive room. These were the same symbols that had been etched around its edges, the same strange script that had made my palms itch when I'd leaned too close. My hands were trembling again. I watched them shake as I raised my right hand toward the frame, watched my fingers extend toward the nearest symbol as if they belonged to someone else entirely. The wood was rough under my fingertips, splintered. Whatever had made these marks had done so with force, with purpose, gouging into the old oak hard enough to send fragments scattering across the threshold. I could see them now, tiny curls of pale wood scattered across the floorboards, evidence that this had happened recently, that this had happened while I slept, while I lay frozen, listening to laughter that came from everywhere and nowhere. I traced the first symbol, then the second. The grooves were deeper than they looked, deep enough that I could feel the texture of them, the deliberate curves and sharp angles. My fingertips came away with dust and splinters, and I stood there in the doorway of my rented apartment, staring at marks that had no business existing, that violated every rational explanation I could construct. Someone had broken in. That was the logical answer. Some vandal, some prankster, some local with a grudge against foreigners who rented rooms above tobacco shops. They'd picked the lock or found a spare key, scratched these symbols into the wood as some kind of message or warning or joke, and left the door open behind them. But the symbols? How would they know the symbols? I hadn't told anyone about the mask, hadn't described it, hadn't sketched the markings, hadn't done anything but stand in that archive room and stare at it for 10 minutes before Dr. Wilkins found me. The only people who knew what those symbols looked like were the museum staff, and even Even they kept that room locked. Even they didn't go in unless they had to. My throat was tight again. That same feeling from the night, that primal response to wrongness, and I leaned against the doorframe and tried to breathe through it. The wood pressed against my shoulder, solid and real, and I focused on that sensation, on the physical fact of the building around me, whatever I'd disturbed in the archives, whatever I'd woken when I'd pushed open that door and stood before that grinning bronze face. It had followed me home. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for the light to shift, for the shadows to shorten, for the sounds of the street below to grow from early morning quiet to the full bustle of a Neapolitan day. Motor scooters and shouting vendors and the clatter of shop fronts being raised. The symbols didn't change, didn't fade, didn't reveal themselves to be some trick of light and imagination. I traced them again, one by one, committing their shapes to memory. 12 symbols in total, arranged in a column, each distinct but clearly part of the same system, the same language, if language was what it was, the same message, if message was what it meant. My palms itched, the same sensation I'd felt in the archive room standing before the mask, and I looked down at my hands and saw nothing. No marks, no redness, just pale skin and light freckles and the faint blue lines of veins beneath the surface. But the itching didn't stop. I understood something then, standing in that doorway with the morning sun warming my back and the symbols dark against the wood. Understood it the way you understand a diagnosis or a death or any piece of news that changes the shape of your life. The mask's discovery had set something in motion, something old, something that had been waiting in that locked room, in that bronze face, in those hollow eyes that seemed to watch, even though they couldn't watch anything at all. And whatever it was, whatever I'd woken, whatever I'd disturbed, whatever had scratched these symbols into my door while I lay frozen and listening to impossible laughter, I couldn't ignore it. I'd tried to tell myself it was nothing, a nightmare, an overactive imagination, the product of stress and unfamiliarity and an artifact that had gotten under my skin. But the symbols were real. The open door was real. The splinters of wood scattered across my threshold were real. And somewhere in the museum, in a locked room in the basement archives, a bronze mask was waiting, grinning, patient. I closed the door, locked it, checked it twice the way my mother had taught me. Then I went to make my coffee, because there was nothing else to do, and because the day was waiting, and because I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones and wouldn't leave, that this was only the beginning. I went back the next morning. Couldn't stay away. The tram rattled through streets already thick with heat, and I sat with my satchel on my lap and my hands pressed flat against the leather. The scars on my palms had faded to thin white lines overnight, faster than any cut should heal, faster than made sense. But they itched something fierce, a low, persistent itch that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the skin. I told myself I was being sensible, responsible even. Dr. Wilkins had given me explicit instructions: stay out of the sealed room, leave the mask alone, forget I'd ever seen it. And I meant to follow those instructions. I did. But the symbols wouldn't leave me alone. I'd dreamed of them. Woken at 3 a.m. with the sheets twisted around my legs and the taste of copper in my mouth, certain I'd been reading something important, something carved into stone, or flesh, or both. The memory scattered when I reached for it, but the feeling remained, that sense of almost understanding, of standing at the edge of a revelation I couldn't quite grasp. So I went back. Not to the room itself. I wasn't that foolish, but to the archives, to the records. Somewhere in those endless shelves of acquisition logs and provenance documents, there had to be information about where the mask had come from, who had made it, what it was meant to do. I was a researcher after all. This was what I did. Cooper found me around 11. I'd set up at one of the long tables in the main cataloging room, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence files from the 1890s. The museum's acquisition records from that era were a mess. Handwritten notes in 3 different languages, half of them water-damaged. The organizational system either brilliant or insane, depending on how charitable you felt. I'd been at it for 2 hours and had managed to trace exactly nothing. Bridges. Cooper's voice came from somewhere behind my left shoulder. "You are here early." I looked up, blinking against the transition from yellowed paper to electric light. Cooper stood at the end of the table with a ceramic cup in each hand, steam rising from both. His cotton gloves were pristine white, as always. The man went through a fresh pair every day. Something about the oils in human skin degrading paper fibers. His reading glasses sat crooked on his nose. "Couldn't sleep," I said. "Thought I'd get a start on The Sealed Room." He set one cup down in front of me. Coffee, thick and dark. "You are researching The Sealed Room." It wasn't a question. The mask, specifically. I wrapped my hands around the cup, grateful for the warmth despite the summer heat. "I'm trying to find the original acquisition records. Where it came from, who sold it to the museum." "Stop!" The word came out sharp, louder than I'd ever heard Cooper speak. I looked up. His face had gone pale beneath the olive complexion, a grayish tinge around his mouth that made him look suddenly old. His hands, still holding his own coffee cup, trembled slightly. "Cooper, what's wrong?" "The symbols." He set his cup down with exaggerated care, as if afraid he might drop it. "On the mask. You saw them, yes? Described them to Dr. Wilkins?" Yes, geometric patterns mostly. Spirals and interlocking triangles. Some kind of script around the edges that I didn't recognize. Dio mio." He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down heavily. "You touched it. You put your hands on it." The scars on my palms itched. "It was an accident. I didn't know." "Of course you did not know. How could you know?" He rubbed his face with both hands, leaving white cotton streaks across his cheeks. 15 years I have worked here. 15 years. And I hoped, that perhaps we were finished, that it was over. "Cooper," I leaned forward. "What are you talking about? What's over?" He looked at me then. Really looked, the way you look at someone when you're trying to memorize their face. "You are the 4th, he said quietly. "The 4th archivist to catalog items from that room." The story came out in fragments. Cooper spoke in rapid bursts, his accent thickening as he grew more agitated. He kept stopping to glance toward the doorway, as if expecting Dr. Wilkins to appear and silence him. His hands never stopped moving, adjusting his glasses, smoothing the edge of a ledger, pulling at the fingers of his gloves. 3 archivists before me, 3 people who had done exactly what I had done, opened that door, cataloged those objects, touched things they shouldn't have touched. The first had been a man named Rossi, before Cooper's time, but the story had passed down through the staff the way such stories do. Rossi had been meticulous, systematic, the kind of cataloger who triple-checked every entry. 6 weeks after beginning work on the sealed room's contents, he'd been found in the museum basement, naked and screaming, trying to carve symbols into the stone floor with his fingernails. They'd taken him to a hospital on the mainland. He never spoke again. The second was a woman called Marchetti. Cooper had known her, worked alongside her for 3 years before she volunteered to finish what Rossi had started. She lasted longer, almost 4 months. But toward the end, she'd stopped sleeping, stopped eating, spent her nights wandering the museum corridors, talking to someone no one else could see. The breakdown, when it came, was quieter than Rossi's. She simply walked out one morning and never came back. Her family found her 2 weeks later, living rough in the hills above Sorrento, convinced that something was following her. She was still in a facility in Rome, Cooper said. Still convinced. And then there was Lauren. Cooper's voice dropped when he spoke her name. Lauren Bates, 31 years old, dark hair, hazel eyes, a laugh that could fill a room. She'd come to Naples 5 years ago, full of passion for the work, for the history, for all the same things that had drawn me here. She was careful, Cooper said. So careful. She knew what had happened to the others. She wore gloves. Always. Never touched anything directly. She thought, we all thought, that would be enough. But it wasn't. No. He looked down at his hands. It was not. Lauren had lasted longer than the others. 8 months, almost 9. But the change, when it came, was the same. The sleeplessness, the distraction, the sense that she was listening to something no one else could hear. In her final weeks, she'd grown distant, fragmented. She'd trail off mid-sentence, her eyes fixed on something just past your shoulder. On the morning of October the 15th, she'd walked out of her apartment before dawn, walked through the empty streets, past the harbor, down to the water's edge. They'd found her shoes on the rocks at Posillipo. Her body never surfaced. The bay is deep there, Cooper said. The currents, they take things far out. But we knew. Everyone knew. He reached across the table and gripped my wrist. His fingers were trembling. You must leave, he said. Request a transfer. Go back to Edinburgh. Go anywhere, but you must leave Naples. Per favore, Bridges, before it is too late. I sat there for a long time after Cooper left. The coffee had gone cold in my cup. The acquisition ledgers lay open in front of me, their water-stained pages full of names and dates that suddenly felt very far away. Through the high windows, I could see a strip of summer sky, impossibly blue. 4 archivists, 3 destroyed, 2 locked away in hospitals, 1 claimed by the sea, and now me, the 4th. I understood what Cooper was telling me. I understood it in my bones, in the white scars on my palms, in the way the dreams had started already. Just one night. Just a few hours of broken sleep. But enough. Enough to know that something had begun, that I'd started something by touching that mask, by bleeding on that stone floor, and that the pattern, stretching back through Rossi and Marchetti and Lauren Bates, was reaching forward now to include me. The sensible thing, the only thing, was to do what Cooper asked. Request a transfer, pack my bags, take the first train north and never look back. But I could still see those symbols carved into the bronze, still feel the weight of the mask in my hands, the way it had seemed to fit against my palms as if it had been made for them, still hear that faint sound, music or wind or voices, rising from somewhere beneath the museum floor. What had I awakened? What was waiting in that sealed room, in that mask, in whatever lay beneath those geometric patterns and that unknown script? I didn't know. And I had to know. That was the thing about me, the thing that had driven me through 3 years of folklore studies, through the long nights in Edinburgh's library basements, through every warning and every caution and every sensible piece of advice I'd ever received. I had to understand, even when understanding was dangerous, even when ignorance might save me. I closed the ledgers, gathered my notes, and went to find Dr. Wilkins. I should have gone home. That's what any sensible person would have done. Found Dr. Wilkins, told her what I'd learned about Lauren Bates and the others, asked the questions that needed asking. Or better yet, packed my bag, caught the next train to Rome and taken the first ship back to Edinburgh. Forgotten about the mask and the museum and the way my palms still itched where the scars had been. Instead, I waited. The museum emptied slowly that evening. Footsteps echoing through the galleries overhead, voices calling out farewells in Italian, the heavy thunk of doors being locked one by one. I sat at my desk in the archives, pretending to work on the catalog entries I'd been neglecting, watching the light change through the narrow windows near the ceiling. Late afternoon gold fading to amber, then to the soft purple of a Mediterranean dusk. Cooper left around 6. Stopped by my desk on his way out, asked if I wanted to grab dinner at the trattoria near his flat. "Can't," I said. "Got a few more entries to finish." He looked at me with that expression he'd been wearing more and more lately. Concern, maybe, or suspicion. Hard to tell with Cooper. "You've been spending a lot of time down here. It's my job. Your job ends at 5 Bridges, same as everyone else's." I shrugged, kept my eyes on the ledger in front of me, the words blurring into meaningless shapes. I want to get ahead, make a good impression. Cooper stood there for a long moment. I could feel him watching me, weighing something in his mind. Then he sighed. "Just be careful, yeah? This place gets strange after dark." I almost laughed, almost asked him what he meant by that. But he was already walking away, his footsteps fading up the stairs. And then I was alone. The silence settled around me, heavy, expectant. I told myself I was staying to work, told myself the compulsion pulling at my chest was just professional curiosity, the same drive that had carried me through 3 years of graduate study and brought me to Naples in the first place. I was a folklorist. Understanding the strange and unexplained was literally what I'd been trained to do, but that wasn't it. Not really. The mask was calling me. I know how that sounds. Melodramatic. The sort of thing you'd read in a penny dreadful. Not here from a grown man with a university degree. But I don't know how else to describe it. There was something in my chest, beneath my ribs, a thread of wanting that tugged me toward the locked door at the end of the corridor. Every time I tried to focus on my work, my thoughts drifted back to that small, dark room, the velvet lining of the box, the way the mask had felt in my hands, the way it had felt against my face. By 8 o'clock, I'd given up pretending. The stairs down to the restricted collection were darker than I remembered. The museum had switched to emergency lighting after closing. A cost-saving measure, someone had told me, though I suspected there were other reasons, and the bulbs cast everything in a dim amber glow that made the shadows stretch and pool in unexpected places. I had my torch. Small brass thing I'd brought from Edinburgh, reliable and solid in my hand. The beam cut through the darkness as I descended, picking out details I'd walked past 100 times before. The crack in the 7th step. The water stain on the wall where something had leaked decades ago. The iron bracket where a gas lamp had once hung, back when this building had been a palazzo instead of a museum. My footsteps echoed off the stone, too loud in the silence. I should have been afraid. Looking back, I can't explain why I wasn't. Or rather, I was afraid, somewhere deep in the animal part of my brain that knew better than to descend into dark basements alone. But the fear was distant, muffled, buried beneath something stronger. The door to the restricted collection was still locked. I'd memorized the code weeks ago, watching Dr. Wilkins punch it in while pretending to study the artifacts on the opposite shelf. 4 digits, the year of the museum's founding. Not exactly secure, but then again, who would want to break into a room full of cursed objects? Me, apparently. The lock clicked. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. The lilies hit me first. White lilies, their perfume so thick and cloying it seemed to coat the inside of my throat. I stood in the doorway, torch beam sweeping across the room, and for a moment I couldn't process what I was seeing. The shelves were the same. The artifacts were the same. The single bulb overhead cast its weak yellow light across familiar shapes. The bronze mirror, the clay figures, the locked cabinets with their handwritten labels. But the wooden box at the center of the room, the one I'd placed the mask in 2 days ago, was surrounded by flowers. Fresh flowers. White lilies arranged in a perfect circle around the base of the table, their stems crossing and interweaving in a pattern that couldn't have been accidental. Someone had taken time with this. Care. The blooms were pristine, their petals smooth and unblemished, their centers heavy with pollen that glowed faintly gold in the torchlight. I didn't move. Couldn't move. The mask was exactly where I'd left it. I could see the edge of the box, the brass clasp that held it closed. Nothing had been disturbed. Nothing except for the flowers that shouldn't have been there. Lilies. Why lilies? My mind scrambled for explanations. Dr. Wilkins, maybe. She'd come back after I left, seen what I'd done, decided to... What? Decorate the crime scene? Leave me some kind of warning? That didn't make sense. She'd have confronted me directly. She wasn't the type for cryptic messages. Cooper? No. He didn't have access to this level. None of the other archivists did. The cleaning staff came in the mornings, not the evenings, and they never entered the restricted collection anyway, which meant I stopped myself, forced the thought away before it could fully form. There had to be an explanation. There was always an explanation. I was a scholar, for Christ's sake. I dealt in evidence and documentation, not supernatural nonsense. Someone had put these flowers here, a person, with hands and feet and a perfectly reasonable motive I simply hadn't discovered yet. But I knew, deep in my gut, in that place where logic couldn't reach, I knew. No one else had been here. I made myself walk into the room. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around, to run back up the stairs and out of the museum and never look back. But I'd come this far. I'd already broken Dr. Wilkins's trust, already touched something I shouldn't have touched, already started down a path I couldn't see the end of. What was one more step? The lilies rustled as I passed. There was no breeze in the room, no windows, no ventilation to speak of, but the petals shifted anyway, turning toward me as I moved, following me. I tried not to look at them, kept my eyes fixed on the box, on the mask I knew was waiting inside. The smell was overwhelming, sweet and heavy and somehow wrong, the way perfume smells wrong when it's covering something worse. My grandmother had worn lily perfume to funerals. I remembered that suddenly, the memory surfacing from nowhere. She'd told me once that lilies were the flowers of death, the flowers you brought to graves, to viewings, to all the rituals of mourning that humans had invented to make sense of endings. Why would someone leave funeral flowers around a mask? I reached the table, looked down at the circle of white blooms, and beneath the perfume, beneath the cloying sweetness of the lilies, I caught something else, something rotting. It was faint at first, a suggestion more than a smell, but the longer I stood there, the stronger it grew. The sickly sweet decay of fruit left too long in the sun, of flowers past their prime, their stems turning soft and black in the vase water, of meat beginning to spoil, of death. My stomach turned. I pressed the back of my hand to my nose, trying to filter the air through my sleeve, but it didn't help. The smell was everywhere now, seeping into my clothes, my hair, the spaces between my teeth. I could taste it. And then I heard the laughter. It came from behind me. The same sound I'd heard in the corridor 2 days ago, high and bright and utterly wrong. A child's laughter, the kind you'd hear on a playground or in a schoolyard, innocent and carefree. Except there was nothing innocent about it. Nothing carefree. It echoed off the stone walls, bouncing and multiplying until I couldn't tell where it was coming from. In front of me, behind me, all around me. I spun, torch beam cutting wild arcs through the darkness. Nothing. The doorway was empty. The corridor beyond was empty. Just shadows and silence, and the distant amber glow of the emergency lights. The laughter came again, closer now. And this time, it didn't stop. It went on and on, that high tinkling sound, and beneath it I could hear other things. Whispers in a language I didn't recognize, the soft pad of bare feet on stone, the creak of something old, settling, shifting, waking up. "Who's there?" My voice came out thin, strained, nothing at all like the steady academic tone I'd cultivated over 3 years of lectures and presentations. The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I should have run then. The sensible part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive for 24 years, that knew when to back down from a fight and when to walk away from a bad situation, was screaming at me. Screaming that I was alone in a basement full of cursed objects, that something was very wrong, that every second I stayed was the second I was gambling with my life. But I couldn't move, because there was a figure at the end of the corridor. I hadn't seen it arrive. One moment the doorway was empty, and the next, it stood perhaps 30 feet away where the corridor turned toward the stairs, a small shape, child-sized, absolutely still in the dim amber light. My torch beam found it, and I wished immediately that it hadn't. The figure was dark, not wearing dark clothes, not standing in shadow, dark, as if someone had cut a child-shaped hole in the fabric of reality and let the void show through. No features, no face, just an outline, a silhouette, a shape that suggested limbs, and a head without actually possessing them, except for the eyes. The eyes caught the light, reflected it back at me like mirrors, like the eyes of an animal caught in headlights, silver black and too large for any human face. They didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. I felt those eyes on me. Felt them the way you feel a physical weight, a pressure against my chest, my throat, my skin. There was something behind them, something old, something that had been waiting in the dark long before I'd come to Naples, long before the museum had been built, long before the mask had been carved from wood and bone and whatever else had gone into its making. Something hungry. I couldn't breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there watching me with an intensity that made my bones ache, that made my blood run cold, that made every instinct I had scream that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. My torch flickered. The figure tilted its head. A small movement, curious. And then it smiled. I couldn't see a mouth. Couldn't see anything but those silver black eyes and the void dark shape of its body. But I knew it was smiling, knew it the way I knew my own name, my own heartbeat, the terror clawing its way up my throat. I ran. There was no decision, no conscious choice. One moment I was frozen, staring at that impossible figure, and the next my body was moving without permission. Legs pumping, arms swinging, torch beam bouncing wildly off the walls as I sprinted for the emergency exit at the far end of the corridor. Professional composure, academic dignity, 3 years of training myself to be calm and measured and thoughtful. Gone. All of it. Stripped away in an instant, leaving nothing but animal panic. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Small footsteps. Light and quick on the stone floor, too fast for anything human, for any child running in the dark. And there were more than one. They pattered against the stone, dozens of them, hundreds of them, the sound multiplying and echoing until it seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the ceiling, from the shadows between the shelves, the spaces beneath the tables, the darkness that pressed in on every side. I didn't look back. Couldn't look back. The emergency exit was ahead of me, a metal door with a push bar that I'd never used, had never thought I'd need to use. The footsteps were getting closer. I could hear breathing now, not my own ragged gasps, but something else, something soft and wrong, like a child trying not to laugh, like children, plural. My hand hit the push bar. The door flew open, and I was out. The Neapolitan night hit me like a wave. Warm air, The smell of exhaust and cooking, and the distant salt of the harbor. Streetlights casting pools of orange across the pavement. The sound of traffic, of voices, of life continuing on as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis and shown me something that shouldn't exist. I stumbled onto the sidewalk, gasping. My lungs burned. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them. My hands were shaking. No, my whole body was shaking, tremors running through me like electricity, like fever. I turned back to the door. It had swung shut behind me, metal and solid, nothing showing through the small wire-reinforced window but darkness. No figures, no silver-black eyes, no sound of footsteps or laughter or anything at all. Just the night, just the city, just me, standing on a sidewalk in Naples with my torch still clutched in my white-knuckled grip, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen wasn't real. It didn't work. The terror was still there, irrational and completely justified, all at once. I knew what I'd seen, knew it in my bones, in my blood, in the scars on my palms that had healed too fast and still itched with something that might have been memory. Something was in that museum, something old, something hungry. And I had woken it up. She was waiting for me. I saw her from the end of the street, a small, dark figure standing beneath the awning of the tobacco shop, her arms crossed over her chest in that way she had. That disapproving posture I'd come to know well over the past weeks. Only this time there was something else in the set of her shoulders. Something that looked almost like fear. My feet slowed without my telling them to. The evening crowds pushed past me. Men heading home from work. Women carrying baskets from the market. Children darting between legs with the careless energy of youth. Normal people living normal lives. And there was Dr. Wilkins, waiting in the shadows like something out of a cautionary tale. I'd been walking for hours, wandering the city without purpose, trying to outpace the dread that had settled into my chest. The museum had closed at 5, and I'd left with the other staff, nodding goodbye to the security guard, stepping out into the golden afternoon light. But I hadn't gone home. Couldn't face those 2 rooms above the tobacco shop. Couldn't face the silence and the waiting and the itching in my palms that wouldn't stop. So I'd walked through the narrow streets of the old city, past churches with their heavy wooden doors and faded frescoes, past trattorias spilling music and the smell of garlic into the evening air, past ruins that had stood for 2,000 years, watching generations of men come and go, their stones worn smooth by countless hands. I'd walked until my feet ached and the sun began to sink toward the bay, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. And now, here was Dr. Wilkins, waiting. Mr. Bridges. Her voice cut through the noise of the street, sharp and clear despite the distance. I think it is time we talked. I approached slowly. The tobacco shop owner was closing up for the night, pulling in the wooden signs that advertised his wares. He nodded to me as I passed. We'd developed that sort of relationship, the nods and half-smiles of people who share a building without really knowing each other. He didn't seem to notice Dr. Wilkins at all. How long have you been here? Long enough. She uncrossed her arms. In the fading light, the silver streaks in her hair looked almost white. I went to your apartment first. When you did not answer, I waited. I was walking. Yes. I imagine you were. She glanced up at the windows above the shop, then back at me. May we go inside? What I have to tell you, it is not for the street. I should have said no. Should have told her I'd had enough of her half-truths and ominous warnings, enough of the way she parceled out information like a miser counting coins. But the fear in her eyes was real, and the itching in my palms had grown worse, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I said, come up. The apartment felt smaller with her in it. Dr. Wilkins stood in the center of my sitting room, her gaze moving over the sparse furnishings, the narrow bed visible through the doorway, the desk piled with books and papers, the single window overlooking the street below. She didn't sit, though I gestured toward the worn armchair by the cold fireplace. This is where you live. Not a question, an observation, tinged with something I couldn't quite identify. It's what I can afford on an archivist's salary. I closed the door behind us, shutting out the sounds of the street. The room fell into an uncomfortable quiet. You said you had something to tell me. She turned to face me. In the dim light filtering through the window, her features looked sharper than usual, the lines around her eyes deeper, the thin press of her lips almost painful. The mask, she said. You have been asking questions, looking through the old ledgers. Cooper tells me you found the photograph. My heart stuttered. Cooper told you? Cooper tells me everything. She raised a hand to forestall my protest. Do not blame him. He is worried about you, as am I. Then maybe you should have told me the truth from the beginning. The words came out harder than I intended. 3 weeks of frustration and fear and unanswered questions, all of it pressing against my chest, instead of leaving me to stumble around in the dark. The truth. She said the word as though it tasted bitter. You want the truth, Mr. Bridges? The truth is what killed Lauren Bates. The truth is what killed 3 archivists before her. The truth. Her voice cracked. She stopped, took a breath, started again. The truth is something I have spent 20 years trying to protect people from. I waited. The itching in my palms had become a burning. Sit down, she said finally. Please. This will take some time. I sat on the edge of the bed for lack of a better option. Dr. Wilkins remained standing, her hands clasped before her in that way that made me think of priests, of confessionals, of sins too heavy to speak aloud. What do you know of the eruption of Vesuvius? She asked. The question surprised me. The basics. August of 79, Common Era. Pompeii and Herculaneum buried under ash and pumice. Thousands dead. Thousands! She nodded slowly. Yes, thousands. And in the weeks before the eruption, do you know what happened? I thought back to my studies. Earthquakes. The historical accounts mention earthquakes. Earthquakes. Cracks in the earth. Steam rising from the mountain. The wells running dry. She began to pace, her low heels clicking against the worn floorboards. The signs were there, Mr. Bridges. The people of Pompeii knew something was wrong. They felt it in their bones, the way animals feel a storm before it breaks. But they did not understand what was coming. How could they? Nothing in their experience had prepared them for such a thing. So they turned to their gods. They turned to their gods. She stopped by the window, looking out at the darkening street. They made offerings, sacrifices, the usual things, wine and grain, cattle and sheep. But the earthquakes continued. The signs grew worse. And the priests began to whisper that the old gods demanded something more. A cold finger traced its way down my spine. Children. She didn't turn around. Yes, children. The room had grown darker while she spoke. I should have lit a lamp, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Couldn't do anything but sit there on the edge of my narrow bed, my hands pressed flat against my thighs, and listen. There were 7 of them, Dr. Wilkins said. Her voice had gone soft, almost gentle, as though she were telling a story to a child. 7 children, chosen for the purity of their spirits. The priests believed, they truly believed, that if they offered these innocent lives to Vulcan, the god would be appeased. The mountain would fall silent. Pompeii would be saved. But it wasn't. No. She turned from the window. In the dimness, her face was a study in shadow. The ritual failed. Or perhaps it never had any power to begin with. The mountain erupted 3 days later. The children died for nothing. I thought of the mask in that locked room, the small face it had been molded to fit. The mask was placed on one of the children during the ritual. A boy, we believe, though we cannot be certain. He would have been perhaps 8 or 9 years old. She paused. The priest believed that covering the children's faces would hide them from the world of the living, would ease their passage into the realm of the dead, would prevent their spirits from looking back. But it didn't work. No, Mr. Bridges, it did not work at all. She told me the rest in fragments, pieces of a puzzle I'd been trying to assemble since the day I first touched that cursed bronze. The mask had been found in 1893 in a small chamber beneath what had once been a temple. The excavators had thought it was a treasure, and in a way, it was. A perfectly preserved piece of ritual bronze, detailed down to the eyelashes. Museums in Rome and Paris and London had all expressed interest. But then the first archivist had died. His name was Giovanni Rossi. Dr. Wilkins had finally taken the armchair, settling into it as though her bones ached. He was the one who catalogued the mask initially. 3 weeks after handling it, he walked into the bay and drowned himself. You said there were others. 4 more. Over the span of 60 years. Each one had direct contact with the mask. Each one died within a month of that contact. She met my eyes. The museum board wanted to sell it at first, get rid of the problem. But every potential buyer, they withdrew their offers, made excuses, said they had changed their minds. It was as though the mask refused to leave. So you sealed it away. In 1953, yes, my predecessor, a woman named Maria Conti, she was the one who finally understood what we were dealing with. She found references in the older texts, descriptions of the ritual, fragments of the prayers that had been spoken over those children. She realized that the spirits were not simply haunting the mask. They were bound to it, trapped. The burning in my palms had become almost unbearable. I looked down at the thin white scars crossing my skin, the cuts that had healed too fast. They're angry, I said. It wasn't a question. They are hungry. Dr. Wilkins leaned forward in the chair. Think of it, Mr. Bridges. 7 children, murdered by the very people who were meant to protect them, promised that their deaths would save their families, their city, everything they loved. And then, nothing. The mountain erupted anyway. Their sacrifice meant nothing. Their lives, their futures, their chance to grow and love and become, all of it stolen. For nothing. I thought of the cold I'd felt in that basement room. The whispers in languages I almost understood. The sensation of small hands pressing against my chest. They want what was taken from them. They cannot have it back. The dead cannot reclaim their lives. She shook her head slowly. But they can take, from those who disturb their rest, from those who remind them of what they lost. Everyone who touches that mask, they become a target, a vessel for all that grief and rage and hunger. What happens to them? The archivists who died, what did the spirits take? Dr. Wilkins was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Everything. Their futures. Their potential. All the years they might have lived. All the things they might have done. The spirits drain it away, piece by piece, until there is nothing left but a shell. And then... She made a small gesture with her hand. The shell breaks. Giovanni walked into the bay. Lauren, her voice caught. Lauren simply stopped. Her heart gave out while she was cataloging in the basement. She was 26 years old. The same age I would be in 2 years. 26. A lifetime ahead of her. Stolen in an instant. Why didn't you warn me? The question came out rough, scraped raw. Before I ever went into that room, why didn't you tell me? Because I hoped... She stopped. pressed her thin lips together. I hoped that if you stayed away, if you never touched it, you would be safe. The seal had held for 70 years. No one had disturbed the mask in all that time. I thought perhaps the spirits had finally quieted, but they hadn't. No. She looked at my hands, at the scars I couldn't stop rubbing. No, Mr. Bridges. They were only waiting. The apartment had grown fully dark by the time she finished. Neither of us had moved to light a lamp. There was something appropriate about sitting in the shadows, I thought. Something fitting about discussing the dead in darkness. There must be a way, I said. To stop it, to break the binding, or appease the spirits, or something. Dr. Wilkins rose from the armchair. She moved slowly, deliberately, like someone carrying a great weight. There is a way, or there may be. Maria Conti. She found references to a ritual of acknowledgement, a way to give the spirits what they truly want, which is recognition. She reached into the pocket of her blazer and withdrew something wrapped in cloth. They were killed in secret. Their deaths were hidden, their suffering denied. For 2,000 years, no one has spoken their names or acknowledged their pain. The ritual Maria found, it is a way of seeing them, of telling them that we know what was done to them, that we grieve for them. She crossed the room and pressed the wrapped object into my hands. It was heavier than I expected, solid and cool through the thin fabric. I pulled back the cloth. A clay tablet, perhaps 6 inches long and 4 inches wide. The surface was covered in tiny inscriptions, letters I recognized as Latin mixed with older symbols I couldn't identify. The clay was the color of dried blood in the darkness. What is this? The prayer. The words Maria reconstructed from the fragments she found. Dr. Wilkins's hand trembled slightly as she withdrew it. You must take the mask back to its sealed room, and while you do so, you must recite these words, exactly as they are written, not one syllable different. I turned the tablet over in my hands. The inscriptions continued on the back, line after line of cramped text. I can barely read this. You must learn, quickly. She stepped back, her arms crossing over her chest again. The spirits, they have already begun to take from you. I can see it. The pallor of your skin, the way you move, as though your limbs are heavy. Every hour that passes, they will take more. If you do not complete the ritual, I'll end up walking into the bay, or my heart will stop in the basement. Yes. I looked at the tablet, at the ancient words that might save my life or damn me trying. The clay was cool against my scarred palms. What exactly do the words say? They acknowledge the children's suffering, their innocence, the injustice of their deaths. Dr. Wilkins moved toward the door. They tell the spirits that someone finally sees them, that someone finally understands. And they ask, they beg for forgiveness, not for what you have done, but for what was done to them, for the world that let them die. And if I say the words, if I complete the ritual? She paused with her hand on the door. In the darkness, I could barely make out her profile. The sharp nose, the heavy brow, the silver-streaked hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch the skin of her temples. Then perhaps the spirits will be appeased. Perhaps they will release you. She opened the door. The sounds of the street below drifted up, distant laughter, the clatter of a cart on cobblestones, the ordinary music of a city settling into night. Or perhaps they will not. Maria Conti never had the chance to test her theory. She died before she could find someone willing to try. How did she die? Dr. Wilkins didn't answer. She stepped through the doorway and paused, looking back at me over her shoulder. The museum opens at 8. I will ensure the basement is empty. You must complete the ritual before noon. That is when the spirits are weakest, when the sun is highest. After that." She shook her head. "I cannot say what will happen after that." And then she was gone. Her footsteps echoed on the stairs, growing fainter, until I heard the street door open and close. The tobacco shop owner called out a farewell. He must have been sweeping the front step. And then silence. I sat there in the darkness, the clay tablet heavy in my hands. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Minutes, maybe. An hour. The tablet grew warm from the heat of my palms, the inscriptions pressing into my scarred skin like a brand. Outside, the street sounds faded as the city settled into sleep. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A woman's voice rose in song, then fell silent. Eventually, I made myself move, lit the oil lamp on my desk, carried the tablet to the pool of yellow light, and set it down among my scattered papers. The inscriptions were clearer now, in the lamplight. Latin, mostly, but mixed with something older. Oscan, perhaps, the language spoken in this region before Rome conquered it. I'd studied Oscan briefly in Edinburgh, enough to recognize the letter forms, not enough to read them fluently, but I could learn. Dr. Wilkins was right about that. I had the training, I had the knowledge, and I had until noon tomorrow to commit these words to memory. I pulled a blank sheet of paper toward me and began to transcribe the first line. The letters were cramped and faded, worn by centuries of handling. Some were barely legible, but as I worked, copying each symbol carefully, the words began to take shape. "We see you." That was the opening, simple, direct, an acknowledgement of presence. "We see you, children of Pompeii. We see your suffering. We see your fear." The second line was harder, the Oscan phrases tangled with Latin in ways that made my head ache. But I kept working, copying, translating where I could, marking the uncertain passages for review. Your deaths were unjust. Your sacrifice was stolen. The mountain took what should have been yours, your years, your joys, your futures yet unwritten. The scars on my palms throbbed as I wrote, a dull, persistent ache that matched the rhythm of my heart. The spirits were still there, I realized, still watching, still hungry. But perhaps if I could find the right words, say them with the right intention, perhaps they would finally be able to rest. I turned the tablet over and continued transcribing. The night stretched ahead of me, long and dark and full of ancient grief, but I had work to do. I studied the tablet until my eyes burned and the lamp began to gutter, line by line, word by word, committing each phrase to memory, rehearsing the pronunciation under my breath until the sounds felt natural on my tongue. We grieve for you. We honor your memory. We ask not for forgiveness, but offer our own. Forgiveness for a world that failed to protect you. The final lines were the hardest, not because of the language. By then I'd puzzled out most of the Oscan roots, but because of what they asked. Release your hold on the living. Return to your rest. Know that you are seen. Know that you are mourned. Know that you will not be forgotten. A promise. That's what it was. A promise to remember, to carry the weight of their deaths forward into a future they would never see. I set down my pen and looked at the tablet, at the words I would speak tomorrow in that cold basement room with the mask of a murdered child watching me from its pedestal. I knew what I had to do. Whether I had the courage to do it, that was another question entirely. Midnight. That's when I went back down. The museum was different in the dark. I'd been there late before, cataloging by lamplight when the summer heat made daytime work unbearable. But this was something else. This was the building stripped of all its pretenses. No visitors shuffling through the galleries. No guards making their rounds. No distant clatter of typewriters from the administrative offices above. Just stone and shadow, and the weight of everything those walls contained. I'd gotten in through the loading dock. Cooper had shown me that trick weeks ago, back when I was just a young Scot learning the rhythms of a new workplace. The lock was temperamental, he'd said. Jiggle it just so and it'd pop open. He'd meant it as a convenience for late nights. I don't think he'd imagined this. The mask was in my satchel, heavy against my hip with every step I took down into the basement levels. Dr. Wilkins had given me the prayer that afternoon, written in her careful hand on a piece of paper. So old the edges had gone brown and soft. Latin words I'd practiced until my tongue ached. Words that had been spoken before, she'd told me, by others who had tried, others who had failed. I tried not to think about Lauren Bates, about what Cooper had told me, about the way her name appeared in those ledgers and then simply stopped. The stairs seemed longer in the dark. I counted them the way I'd counted them that first day, 17 steps, a landing, then 12 more. My hand found the wall and I let it guide me, the stone cold and slightly damp beneath my palm. The scars there pulsed with something that wasn't quite pain. Recognition, maybe. Memory. At the bottom, I stopped. She was waiting for me, the child figure, the girl, standing directly in my path, not 3 feet from the base of the stairs, her form more solid than I'd ever seen it. More real. The silver of her eyes caught light that didn't exist. No lamps burning, no moonlight reaching this deep into the earth, and threw it back at me in cold accusation. I'd known she would be here. Dr. Wilkins had warned me, but knowing something and standing in front of it are two different creatures entirely. My hand went to my satchel, touched the leather, the shape of the mask beneath. The girl tilted her head, that same awful movement, that wrongness of angle that made my stomach turn. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her presence was enough, a barrier as solid as any wall, as final as any locked door. You shouldn't be here. The thought wasn't mine, couldn't have been mine, but it slid into my head all the same, cold and certain. None of you should be here. Behind her, the darkness moved. I'd thought, God help me, I'd actually thought that there was only one, that the girl was singular, unique, some terrible remnant of whatever had happened in this place 2,000 years ago. But as I watched, as my eyes adjusted to the nothing light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once, I saw them, others. They emerged from the shadows the way fog rises from a river, slow and inevitable and utterly silent. Their forms flickered and stuttered, there and not there, solid in smoke. Damaged, I thought. The word came to me unbidden. They looked damaged, their edges uncertain, their features shifting and reforming with each passing moment. Children, all of them children. I counted 7 before I lost track. Their eyes were all the same, that terrible silver, that hungry gleam. Their mouths moved in unison, shaping words I couldn't hear, pleas I couldn't answer. My knees wanted to buckle. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the satchel strap. But I'd made a choice. Up there in my little apartment above the tobacco shop, with the afternoon light fading and Dr. Wilkins' prayer burning a hole in my pocket, I'd chosen this. I opened the satchel. The mask seemed to pulse as my fingers closed around it. Warm, almost alive, its bronze surface catching that impossible light and throwing it back in fractured patterns across the walls. The girl, the first one, the one who'd found me that day in the storage room, took a step back. Just one. But it was enough. They were afraid of it. No, that wasn't right. They were connected to it, bound to it. Whatever this thing was, whatever it represented, they couldn't escape its orbit any more than the moon could escape the earth. I pulled out the paper. Dr. Wilkins's handwriting blurred and swam before my eyes, the darkness too thick, my hands too unsteady. But I'd practiced. Hours of practice. My lips moving silently in my apartment, the words settling into muscle memory. I began to speak. Liberate hos infantes. My voice cracked on the second word, cracked and broke and came out as something barely above a whisper. The spirits, the children, pressed closer. I could feel them now, not touching me, not quite, but near enough that the air around me went cold and sharp. My breath fogged before my face. A vinculus mortis. The girl opened her mouth and screamed. The sound, I can't describe it properly, can't find words that do it justice. It was grief and rage and abandonment all at once. 2,000 years of silence shattered in a single moment. It hit me in the chest with physical force, drove the air from my lungs, sent me stumbling backward until my shoulders struck the stone wall behind me. The others joined her. Their voices rose in a terrible harmony, a chorus of the dead, and the walls themselves seemed to shake with it. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The lamp I'd brought but not yet lit fell from my satchel and shattered on the floor. My knees gave out. I hit the ground hard, stones biting into my palms, the mask still clutched in my hands. The bronze was warming now. No, not warming. Heating, growing hot with a speed that made no sense. That defied every law of the physical world I'd ever learned. The pain was exquisite. I've never been burned before, not properly. A grease splatter here, a brush against a hot pan there. Nothing that prepared me for this. The mask seared into my palms with the intensity of a brand, and I could smell my own flesh cooking. Could feel the skin blistering and splitting as the bronze grew hotter and hotter still. But I didn't let go. Couldn't let go. Dr. Wilkins had been very clear about that. You must hold on, she'd said. No matter what. No matter how much it hurts. The moment you release it, you're lost. Qui in tenebris ambulant. The words came out broken, gasped between waves of agony. My voice had gone high and thin. A stranger's voice, a frightened child's voice. The screaming intensified. I felt it in my teeth, in my bones, in the marrow of me. Ancient fury, ancient grief. These weren't monsters. These weren't demons. They were children. The realization hit me with the force of the scream itself. These were children, terrified children, abandoned children, left here in the dark for 2,000 years with nothing but their rage and their sorrow and this mask, this terrible bronze mask, to keep them company. They weren't evil. They'd never been evil. They were just, lost. Tears streamed down my face. Whether from the pain or the understanding, I couldn't say. Both, probably. The mask burned, and my palms split open along the lines of my old scars, and still I held on. Et in umbra mortis sedent. The girl was close now, close enough that I could see the details of her face, the shape of her nose, the curve of her jaw, the way her hair might have fallen before whatever happened to her happened. She'd been beautiful once, they all had, someone's children, someone's beloved, sacrificed for reasons I might never understand. Da illis lucem perpetuum. My voice steadied, found its footing. The pain was still there. Christ, the pain was everything. But it had become something I could hold alongside the words, something I could carry rather than be crushed by. Et requiem aeternum. The final syllables left my lips and hung in the air between us. The screaming stopped, not faded, not diminished. Stopped, as if someone had cut a wire, as if the sound had never existed at all. The silence that followed was so profound it had weight, texture. I could feel it pressing against my eardrums. The children remained. They stood in their half circle around me, their flickering forms gone suddenly still. The silver of their eyes hadn't changed, still that terrible luminescence. but something in them had shifted, something fundamental. They weren't looking at me with hunger anymore. They were looking at me with something closer to hope? No, that wasn't right either. Not hope. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. I looked down at the mask in my hands. The bronze had cooled as suddenly as it had heated, leaving my palms raw and ruined, blistered skin splitting to show the red meat beneath. The pain had retreated to a distant throbbing, my body's way of protecting itself from what it couldn't process. The box was in my satchel, where I'd packed it that afternoon, following Dr. Wilkins's instructions to the letter. I moved slowly, carefully, every motion deliberate, every gesture measured. The children watched as I reached into the bag. As I withdrew the small wooden box, ancient, the hinges green with verdigris, the wood black with age, as I opened the lid with fingers that left bloody prints on every surface they touched, the mask fit perfectly. Of course it did. It had been made for this box, or the box had been made for it. I settled the bronze face into its velvet lining. Faded now, moth-eaten in places, but still soft against the metal. The empty eye holes stared up at me. I closed the lid. One by one, the children began to fade. Not vanishing, not dissolving, just receding, stepping back into the stone walls that had held them for so long. The girl was last. She stood before me for a long moment, her silver eyes fixed on mine, and I could have sworn, I would swear to my dying day, that her lips curved upward, just slightly, just for an instant. Then she was gone. I knelt alone in the darkness, the box in my ruined hands, and let myself breathe. The sealing took another hour. Dr. Wilkins had given me precise instructions. The mixture of clay and blood. My blood from the wounds the mask had made, because it had to be my blood now, had to be the blood of someone bound to this place. The pattern to trace around the doorframe. The words to speak, different from the prayer, older and stranger. I worked by touch more than sight. My fingers knew the shape of the symbols even though my eyes couldn't see them. The clay was cold and thick against my torn palms, and every time I pressed it into the grooves of the stone, fresh pain shot up my arms. But I didn't stop. When it was done, I stood back and looked at my work. The doorway was sealed, not just locked, but sealed, bound by something older than locks, older than doors. Whatever was in that room would stay there now. The mask in its box, the memories in the walls, the children, finally at rest, I hoped. I climbed the stairs slowly. 17 steps, a landing, 12 more. My legs shook with every motion. My hands hung at my sides, useless, the blood drying to a tacky crust against my palms. Dawn was coming by the time I made it outside. The sky had gone gray at the edges, that particular gray that comes just before the sun. I stood on the loading dock and breathed in the morning air, warm already, thick with the promise of another scorching day, and thought about Lauren Bates. She'd tried this. Maybe not exactly this, but something close. She'd gone down into that darkness and faced what was waiting there, and she hadn't come back. I had. The scars on my palms would never fully heal. I knew that even then, before the doctors told me, before the weeks of bandages and ointments and Cooper's worried glances across the archive tables. Some wounds go too deep, some marks stay forever, but that's the price, isn't it? For understanding, for choosing to know instead of turning away. I'd pay it again. I left Naples 3 days later, not because I wanted to, not because the work was done. It wasn't, not by half. My notebooks were still full of questions, my catalogs incomplete, whole sections of the archive untouched. Dr. Wilkins had arranged for another researcher to take over, someone from Rome with steady hands and no scars to speak of. A professional. The kind of person who could look at an artifact and see only its historical value, its provenance, its place in the long ledger of human civilization. I wasn't that person anymore. Maybe I never had been. The morning I left, the heat had broken. First time in weeks. A cool breeze came down from the hills, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something green and alive that made me think of Scotland, of the moors above Edinburgh where I'd walked as a boy. Strange to smell home in a foreign city. Stranger still to feel homesick for a place I'd been so eager to leave. I packed my bag in the gray light before dawn. Didn't take long. I'd brought so little with me. Clothes, books, the tools of my trade. A few shirts wrinkled beyond repair from the humidity. My notebooks filled now with things I could never share with another scholar. The leather satchel my father had given me when I left for university, worn soft at the corners from years of use. The scars on my palms itched as I folded my shirts. They always did now, at odd moments. When I thought about the mask, when I remembered the cold of that basement room, the weight of those ancient eyes pressing against my mind. The children. God. The children. 3 days since the ritual and I still couldn't close my eyes without seeing them. Not as nightmares. Nothing so simple as that. Just presence. A weight at the edge of my thoughts. Small faces in the darkness behind my eyelids. Watching. Waiting. Patient in the way only the dead can be patient, because they have nothing but time. I'd tried to write about it. Sat at my little desk in the apartment above the tobacco shop, pen in hand, trying to capture what had happened in the language of scholarship, the objective tone of academic inquiry. But the words came out wrong. Clinical phrases that stripped the experience of everything that mattered, or worse. Purple prose that made it sound like fiction, like something invented for effect rather than lived through. In the end, I'd given up. Some things resist being written down. Some knowledge refuses to be shared. Cooper came to see me off. Found him waiting outside my building when I came down with my bag, his hands shoved in his pockets and his face creased with worry. He'd been wearing that expression for days now, ever since I'd come back from the archive with my bandaged palms and my 1,000-yard stare. I hadn't told him what happened, couldn't. But Cooper wasn't stupid. He'd seen enough to guess. "You don't have to go," he said. First words out of his mouth. No greeting, no pleasantries. That was Cooper, straight to the point, always. "I do. Wilkins would let you stay, finish your research. It's not about what Wilkins would let me do." I shifted my bag on my shoulder, felt the weight of my notebooks pressing against my hip. "It's about what I can do, what I'm fit for anymore." He was quiet for a moment. The morning light caught the stubble on his jaw, the dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't been sleeping well either, I realized. My fault, probably. All of this was my fault. What happened down there? Soft voice now. The kind you use with frightened animals or madmen. In the archive, you can tell me. I wanted to. God knows I wanted to. To share the weight of it, spread it across more shoulders than just my own. But what would I say? I touched an ancient mask and saw the ghosts of murdered children. I performed a ritual that bound my soul to theirs. I understand now why Lauren Bates walked into the bay, because some knowledge is too heavy to carry alone. "I found what I was looking for," I said instead. "That's all." Cooper's jaw tightened. He knew I was lying. Or not lying exactly. Just not telling the whole truth. Same thing in the end. "Will you come back?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought about it. Hadn't thought past this moment, this morning, this departure. The future stretched ahead of me, formless and frightening, and I couldn't see my way through it. "I don't know," I said. Honest, at least. "I don't know anything anymore." He nodded. Didn't push. That was Cooper. He knew when to let things go, when pressing would only make them worse. He reached out, clasped my shoulder briefly. warm hand through the thin cotton of my shirt. "Take care of yourself, Bridges." His voice rough around the edges. "Write when you can." I will. I wouldn't. We both knew it. But some lies are kinder than the truth. The station was chaos. Napoli Centrale in the morning rush. I'd never seen anything quite like it. Bodies everywhere, pressing and shoving. Voices raised in rapid Italian that washed over me in waves. Porters with carts piled high with luggage. Vendors selling coffee and pastries from rolling carts. Children running between the legs of adults, laughing, shouting. The air thick with coal smoke and sweat and the peculiar electric tension of 1,000 people all trying to be somewhere else. I found my platform. Checked my ticket 3 times. Second class, northbound, Rome first, and then Florence, and then the long journey up through the Alps. Days of travel ahead of me. Time to think. Time to remember. Too much time, probably. My hands shook as I handed my ticket to the conductor. He noticed. I saw his eyes flick down to my palms, to the thin white scars that crossed them both. His face betrayed nothing. Professional courtesy, or maybe just indifference. He'd seen stranger things than a pale Scotsman with damaged hands. This was Naples. This city had been swallowing foreigners and spitting them back out for 3,000 years. I found my compartment. Small, cramped, smelling of old leather and older tobacco. 2 bench seats facing each other, worn velvet cushions faded to an indeterminate brown. A window streaked with grime looking out onto the platform. I sat, placed my bag beside me, waited. The train wouldn't leave for another 20 minutes. 20 minutes of sitting still, of watching the chaos of the station swirl past my window. I should have brought a book. Something to occupy my hands, my eyes. But my books were packed away, and I didn't have the energy to dig them out. So I just sat, watched, let my thoughts drift. The children came to me then. Not visibly, nothing so dramatic as that. Just a presence at the edge of my mind. The weight of their attention pressing gently against my consciousness. I'd felt it since the ritual, this awareness of them, of their existence, their suffering, their eternal patience. They were always there now, in the basement of my thoughts, watching, waiting, remembering. I remembered too, the mask, cold against my skin, the blood from my palms soaking into ancient bronze, the rush of images, sacrifice after sacrifice, child after child, centuries of suffering compressed into a single terrible moment of understanding. And their eyes, silver black, ancient, full of a grief that transcended time. They had shown me. Let me see. Let me understand. And now I carried that understanding with me, branded into my palms and burned into my memory, forever. The whistle blew, sharp, piercing. I flinched, nearly knocked my bag to the floor. Around me, the station erupted into fresh chaos. Last-minute travelers rushing for the train, porters shouting, conductors calling out in Italian and French and German. The great engine at the front of the train let out a hiss of steam, a mechanical sigh that I felt in my chest. We were leaving. I pressed my hand against the window glass, cool against my scarred palm. Outside, the platform crawled with people. Businessmen in dark suits, women in traveling dresses, families with children in tow, all of them moving, rushing, living their ordinary lives, none of them knowing what waited in the basement of the Museo Archeologico, none of them aware of the ancient dead who still lingered in this city, patient and hungry and impossibly sad. The train lurched, once, twice, then we were moving, sliding forward, the platform beginning to drift past my window. That's when I saw her. A child, standing still in the middle of the crowd while all around her the station swirled with movement. Small. Couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. Dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. A white dress, old-fashioned, the kind you saw in paintings from a century ago. And her eyes, silver black, bright as mirrors, fixed on mine. My breath stopped. My heart, I swear it stopped too for one terrible, endless moment. The scars on my palms flared with sudden heat, and I pressed them harder against the glass, as if I could reach through it, as if I could... What? Touch her? Save her? She'd been dead for 2,000 years. More than dead. Sacrificed. Offered up to gods whose names had been forgotten before Rome fell. There was nothing I could do for her. Nothing anyone could do. But she looked at me, through the glass, through the crowd, through all the years between us. And I looked back. Recognition. That's what I saw in those impossible eyes. Recognition and something else. Gratitude, maybe. Or acceptance. The acknowledgement of a witness. Someone who had seen. Someone who would remember. The train picked up speed. The platform slid faster now, the crowd blurring into streaks of color and movement. But she stayed clear, stayed focused, her eyes never leaving mine. Then, gone. A cluster of travelers passed between us, a group of men in traveling cloaks, and when they'd passed, she was no longer there. Just empty space where she'd been standing, just the ordinary chaos of Napoli Centrale, swallowing the ghost of a murdered child as easily as it swallowed everything else. I sat back. My hands were shaking. My whole body was shaking, I realized. A fine tremor that started somewhere deep in my chest and radiated outward. I pressed my scarred palms together, felt the heat of them, the pulse of blood beneath the thin white lines. She'd been real. I hadn't imagined her. The dead had come to see me off, to remind me of what I'd witnessed, what I'd bound myself to. They remembered me, and I would remember them, forever. The train climbed. Naples fell away behind us, first the station, then the sprawl of the city, then the harbor with its glittering water and its distant ships. The Vesuvius rose to our right, massive and patient, its peak wreathed in the haze of summer. I watched it shrink in my window, this mountain that had buried Pompeii, that had frozen an entire civilization in ash and stone. I understood something about that now, about preservation, about the way trauma could fix a moment in time, keep it alive long after it should have faded. The children in the museum, they were Pompeii too in their way, frozen in the moment of their deaths, preserved by suffering. And now I was part of that preservation, a witness, a keeper of their memory. The hills rose around us, green slopes dotted with olive groves, vineyards climbing toward the sun. Beautiful country. I'd thought about exploring it, back when I first arrived. Day trips to the coast, to the ruins of Herculaneum, to the islands I could see from my apartment window. But I'd never gone. Too absorbed in my work. Too focused on the archive and its secrets. Funny, the things you regret when it's too late. Naples disappeared behind a ridge. One moment it was there, a smudge of white and terracotta against the blue of the bay, and then it was gone. Just hills, just the train rattling northward, carrying me away from everything I'd found and everything I'd lost. I thought about Dr. Wilkins, about the warnings she'd given me, the boundaries she'd tried to set. She'd known. Not everything, maybe, but enough. She'd seen what happened to researchers who looked too closely at certain artifacts. Lauren Bates, the others. She'd tried to protect me from the same fate. And I'd ignored her, pushed past her warnings, convinced that my need to understand outweighed any danger. That knowledge was always worth the cost. I wasn't so sure anymore. My hands rested in my lap, palms up. The scars were fading. They'd been fading since that first morning, healing faster than any natural wound should heal. But they were still there. Thin white lines crossing both palms, a mark that would never fully disappear. A brand. I was different now, changed in ways I couldn't fully articulate. The world looked the same, trees and hills and sky, but I knew it wasn't. I knew there were things beneath the surface, old things, hungry things, patient things that had been waiting since before my ancestors learned to write. I knew that the dead didn't always rest, that some suffering was so profound it echoed across millennia, reaching forward through time to touch anyone foolish enough to listen. I'd listened. I'd reached back. And now I carried them with me, those children, their faces, their eyes, their terrible, patient grief. The train rattled on. The hills rolled past. Somewhere ahead, Rome waited, then Florence, then the Alps, and beyond them, home. But I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones and wouldn't leave, that I'd never really leave Naples behind. That part of me would always be in that basement room, touching bronze that had tasted blood, seeing through eyes that had witnessed sacrifice. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. I pressed my scarred palms together and watched Italy roll past my window, and I thought about the children who would be with me always, and I understood at last why some knowledge comes with a price that can never be fully paid. The dead remember, and so would I.